Please join me in welcoming Chris Williams and Betty Boyd Caroli.
Okay.
How was everybody tonight? Good. Good.
So loud.
That's loud.
Isn't that too loud? No?
Betty, thanks for coming to Louisville.
Thank you.
How many of you have cracked open the book already? How many have read it all the way through? We've got some people who've read it. You need to crack it open. You need to open it up because there are things about Lady Bird Johnson that I would have never imagined. How many years did you spend researching this book?
For this book, I spent 6 years. Wow. Because one of the problems was that some of the papers that I really needed weren't open. For example, the courtship letters. You know, we can talk about the courtship now or later, but Lyndon and Lady Bird met on a September 5, Wednesday afternoon in 1934, and they spent 5 days together. And then, let's see, he had to go back to Washington, where he was working, and he asked her to marry him on the first day, but she thought he was crazy. And so when he got in the car and left the following Tuesday to drive back to Washington, she stayed behind. And for the next 7 or 8 weeks, because he came back on Halloween, so you can count from September 10 to Halloween, you know.
So they weren't allowed to FaceTime? They couldn't connect? No texting? No internet to do that with?
They did do some telephone conversations. Her father didn't have a phone. She had to go to somebody else's house. But those letters were a gold mine for me.
Okay, you have written about a lot of famous people, a lot of famous ladies. When you start digging into these courtship letters, what's the feeling like when you start cracking open those letters and you are reading something that was meant between two young lovers?
Well, reading letters, I did a book called The Roosevelt Women about 15 years ago, and that was full of letters too. There's nothing like looking at the letter that somebody wrote somebody years ago and never expected it to be read. I remember on the Roosevelt Women book, I was sitting, those papers are all in the Harvard Library, and I came across a letter that a husband wrote to his wife when she was traveling in Europe without him, and the letter had never been opened. It was from, it was about 75 years old at the time, that letter. So I didn't think I was supposed to open it, you know. So I when the librarian came in, I showed her the letter and asked her what we should do, and they did open it, and they thought perhaps it had just pulled apart and got restuck. But anyway, reading letters of somebody else is a great way to get to know people. There are about 80 of them, but you can see, particularly in his letters, exactly the kind of person that he became. He was secretive. He could be very nasty. He wrote the first night when he stopped in the motel on the way to Washington, he stopped and wrote a letter, how wonderful it was to be with you and so forth. And he really expected when he got to Washington on Thursday that there was going to be a letter from her to him. But she was a little cautious, you know. She was always a very careful person. So she was holding back, and there was no letter from her. And he wrote her the nastiest letter. What, you don't even care about me. You're probably not even opening the letters I send you. What kind of a person? Really nasty.
And she still decided that he was the fella for her.
She said at that very first meeting that there was electric going. You know, he looked a lot like her father.
He was her dad was a big guy.
Both were 6 feet 3 inches tall. Her father, I mean, I could write a whole book about her father. That's another book. Because he was a very commanding figure in Harrison County, Texas. She was born right near the Louisiana border in, well, it's not a town really. Some of you may have visited the area. I went there because I wanted to see what kind of place she came from. And the house that she was born in and grew up in it's a 17-room mansion with pillars, and it's at a fork in the road outside the town. So when you drive past it, you know that somebody important lived there. It says that right away. 17 rooms, 6 fireplaces. She had a 2-room playhouse out behind the house.
Well,
and that contrasts with Lyndon, where Lyndon was born. Some of you have probably visited Lyndon's birthplace in the hill country. That, you remember, is no big 17-room mansion. It's a low cabin, really, 4 rooms, low ceilings. And I'm told that the original house, because that house was, the original house was torn down in the early 1940s, and the one that we visit now, that's part of the Park Service, that was built in its place. And people who knew both houses say that this is really larger and grander than the house that he was born in.
One of the things that fascinated me early on in the book is her father. And she talked about how she could write a whole book about Lady Bird's dad. There are questions about where he got his money to start things off with and the business dealings that he went through, and whether he was involved in killing her mother. There are questions about, there was all this intrigue in Lady Bird's past that I had no idea before reading your book. A lot of this just has been kind of glossed over by history, hasn't it?
Well, there aren't many biographies of Mrs. Johnson, and there are many of Lyndon, and it seems to me they always say the same thing, more or less, about her, that she was born to a wealthy family. Her mother died when she was 5 by falling down a flight of stairs after she was tripped by a dog. And that story never really rang true to me either. She was reportedly 44 years old, pregnant, and tripped by this dog, fell down the steps.
But she didn't die from the injuries of the fall.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense to me. When I wrote the book First Ladies several years ago, I put that in because that's what everybody said. But it didn't make sense to me then. So that was one of the mysteries that I can tell you I think I solved when I was writing this book. I went to the town. Well, to add to the mystery of the mother, we have to back up, I think, and tell the story.
Yes. Okay, so
Lady Bird's mother was born in Alabama, as was her father, but they were born into very different circumstances. The mother came from a wealthy family, a very cultured, educated family, and Lady Bird's father came from tenant farmer families, a large family. The mother had been married 4 times, had many children, and when the father, whose name was Thomas Jefferson Taylor, met the mother, whose name was Minnie Patillo, they immediately, evidently, fell in love. And her parents wanted nothing to do with him. And so he left and went to Texas to make a fortune. Now, when he got to Texas, as soon as he got over the border, this is 1898, he bought land for about $500. And $500 in 1898 was what a working man could earn in a year. So the question is, where did this young man get his $500? And the local story around that part of Texas is that he robbed a train along the way. I tried to check on that.
Did you find any train robberies?
1898, yes, it was a train robbery, but I couldn't tie it to him, really. He always told his daughter, he told Lady Bird, that he had sold a saddle. But it would have to be a very expensive saddle to bring $500, and where did he get the money for that,
That's a lot of money.
So he arrived in
$500.
Texas. $500 was, yes. I spent quite a lot of time in the county courthouse going through the records then of his land deals, and it becomes very complicated. He would buy, and then he would add, and then he would trade, and then he would divide. But he became the biggest landowner in that part of Texas, in that county. And he owned the 2 cotton gins, he owned the general store where people had to trade. So he was a very important man. And you know what he wanted everybody to call him? Mr. Boss. Even his kids.
This guy made Donald Trump look like Mother Teresa. If you read the book, you get an impression of, as far as being a shrewd businessman and not taking anything from anybody, this guy was the epitome of a big dealer there.
He exploited everybody. I couldn't put many of the things in the book that people told me because I couldn't verify them, but I didn't find anybody who liked him. But she adored him. Lady Bird absolutely adored him. And I think we have to credit him with one thing. He taught her business skills. He was a very shrewd businessman, and he taught her how to do accounts. People said she could read an account book like a truck driver reads a map. And when she was running the radio business, People said she would go over every weekly statement, right down to the toilet paper. You know how much they spent on toilet paper at the station. And she said that her father taught her that value of $1 was one word. You know, it's very important where every cent went. And that's kind of important that he did that for his only daughter. I should say that he had 2 sons, because to back up now, so he gets to Texas in 1898, immediately buys the $500 worth of land, starts trading, sets up a little store, starts making money, goes back, and now Minnie will marry him. So they get married. Her family still doesn't have anything to do with him. They get married, and she moves to this town, which she absolutely detested. She had nothing to do with anybody. She considered them people not on her level. She would much prefer to do what her family used to do, go to the opera in Chicago and have nice leather-bound books and so forth. And here she was in this little speck of a town with a guy who spent all his time on business, you know. So they had 2 sons. First year of the marriage, they had a son. 3 years later, they had another son. And then she, being very unhappy with that part of Texas and with her husband, who already had a reputation as a womanizer, she packed up and took the 2 boys and went back to her family in Alabama. And she stayed for 4 years. And he sued for divorce.
And so he did what every man who wants a woman back does. He bought a big broke-down house and he fixed it up.
And that was the house then that Lady Bird was born in, because she did come back to him, yes, and I talk a lot about the family situation.
And I found that interesting in your book because you paint this picture of basically this dilapidated house this guy bought, and then what he did to it with the 17 bedrooms and everything else. And then the pictures that you see in it are really, your writing really tells that story. It brings it full circle. And then she comes to this house, and here's this giant, beautiful house waiting for her.
Yeah, I don't know how much the house, certainly the house was an impressive one when he brought her back, when she came back. And there were other things going on in her family at that time that I suggest made her want to go back to him. But within a year of their being reunited, the divorce is rescinded and they get back together. Lady Bird is born in 1912. And the 2 boys are sent away to boarding school. And I don't mean boarding school in the next county. I mean so far that they can't even come home for Christmas vacation.
And they didn't send them together.
Well, first they started out together, and then they split them up, which was even more cruel. So it's not a happy family. You know, Lady Bird said her parents had a stressful marriage. I said it was a very miserable marriage. I mean,
But when we say separated, we don't mean one's in Shelbyville and one's in Louisville. We mean one's in New York and one's in New Mexico?
right.
What kind of... That says a lot for her, where her parents were, and primarily her dad, right?
Well, both parents, I think, had very little interest in either of the boys. And when Minnie became pregnant again then in 1918 and died, those boys didn't learn about her death for a year because their father didn't tell them.
What was Lady Bird's feeling about that later in life? I know she idolized her father, and her brothers told her she never really understood what it was like they had it. But how do you think that impacted her, the way that they were treated by her parents at all?
Well, she had a very great knack of being able to shut out anything she didn't want to see or hear. People told me amazing stories how when time came for a medical report to be given or something and she didn't want to hear it, she would just remove herself. She absolutely didn't hear it. And the people who told me that said that they thought that she developed that in a childhood that was extremely lonely, you know, growing up without the brothers. She said she never knew them. I mean, she made kind of jokes about them, you know, the brothers in the early years. And then in 1959, the one brother, the older brother, died. And she said that it was the only time in her life that she really cried. And she said this after Lyndon had died, so that gives you a sense of how, and she said it was because she realized she had a brother that she never even knew. They weren't at all close. Yes, it was a very difficult situation. Do you want me to tell you then about the mother's death? Because you said that...
No, I'm sorry. I'm intrigued. I was in that part of this story. you know, as an investigative journalist, I start thinking, well, where would I dig next for the next document? And I'm following your timeline, and you're in the book. She does a really good job explaining her research and where she went for things, and the people at the library sending her information. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there. But everywhere you turn, you did not find one picture of Lady Bird Johnson's mother, and that, you say, says a lot about the whole story.
Yeah, because what kind of family doesn't have a picture of a woman who died at 44, the mother of 3 children? I mean, I know we're talking, well, she was born in 1874, but my grandmother was born in 1884, and we certainly had pictures of her at young ages. So the fact that no photo of her survives. Lady Bird never had a photo of her mother. She had some vague memories of when she was 5, and her mother read to her or wiped her face clean or something, but very vague memories because no picture. So no picture survives. The husband who survives does not want her name mentioned again. I went to the local church where the funeral would have been held. The church has no record that a funeral was ever held. I went to the county courthouse for a death certificate, and it said that she died of septicemia, which we call blood poisoning, right? So I've got a woman who's pregnant. Everybody said she was pregnant. When I interviewed people in the town, they said, well, I remember she was pregnant. So I said, well, she has to have been fairly obviously pregnant, right? So that means there would have been an unborn child that also died in this. So I'll go to her tombstone. She has a beautiful tombstone. No mention of any unborn child or dead child or so forth. I have to say that Minnie has the reputation, I think, of being about the most selfish, self-centered person you can imagine. And her tombstone inscription is something like, forgetting herself, she thought only of others. Which has to be the most inappropriate thing to put on a tombstone. So there's nothing on the tombstone. I went to the local newspaper. The copies for those weeks are all missing. There are only 2 sets, one at the newspaper and one...
I'm having fun listening to this story and looking at here, because those people that when we joked early on saying, oh, maybe she was murdered by this guy, a lot of people just shook their head. There's no way. Now they're like, wow, they're building the case up there.
Well, actually, one historian did suggest that her husband pushed her down the flight of stairs, that it wasn't the dog that did it, but it was...
But through all of that...
Can I just say what I decided?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You want to know what I decided? I taught women's history for 20 years or so, and I knew that a common cause of death in that period, we're talking about 1918, right, for women who tried to abort using a metal object was blood poisoning, because there was no way to treat it, really. So I say in the book that if I had to put money on it, I would put it on a botched abortion. And in fact, somebody in the town suggested that. One woman was saying, it could have been this, it could have been that, it could have been a botched abortion, and I went, bingo, you know, it really fit, it fit all the evidence. Now, also her lack of mothering skills, her lack of interest in having another child, because we said she had already sent the 2 boys away to boarding school, and Lady Bird said that even though she was only 5 years old, her mother had already started collecting information on where to send her. And one of the schools was Washington, D.C., in Washington, D.C. So think how that would have been for a little girl, 6, 7 years old, to be sent away to boarding school. Her parents are in Texas, and she's in Washington, D.C. So I think we have a mother who wasn't too interested in having another child. I would speculate that.
When we see the front cover of the book, and you'll see it there's this shot from behind of the first couple. And Lady Bird Johnson has her hand on the back of LBJ. And this picture is so perfect for what you learn in this book about how the shortcomings of LBJ that no one ever saw, only she knew, and how she put up with him and continued to push him along. How fascinated were you as you read into their later years and their years in the White House, how much of an advisor she truly was in keeping him stable? And here's a guy who was known for outbursts.
Yeah, I think the picture is great. I didn't choose it. I had nothing to do with it. I don't even know. I never saw it until they asked me thought of it. And I think it sums up the book very well, because if I had to say why I subtitled the book, The Hidden Story of a Marriage That Made a President, it would be that I think without her, or a woman with her talents, Lyndon Johnson would never have climbed the political ladder at all. And you mentioned his moods. I think she knew better than anybody these enormous mood swings that he would go through. Well, I mentioned them in the courtship letters. I mean, on one day he'll say, oh, I'm on top of the world. If you'll just come here and marry me, we'll be able to do enormous things. We'll have a great life together. We've got to get married tomorrow. And then the next letter, or 2 days later, he was saying, oh, everything's going wrong. It's going to be 4 or 5 years before we can get married. And she would write and say, what's going on? So she knew that, and as you say, she accepted it. He was secretive. Remember the Vietnam period when people accused him of not giving out real numbers, of being secretive? He was secretive back in those letters. He would say, oh, something's really coming, and we may have big news, but I can't tell you what it is, fearing the outcome as I do. And she would say, oh, please, just, tell me, I can take it, tell me. He'd say, no, I wrote you a letter, but I tore it up. So his, I've already mentioned his tendency to be nasty and really mean to people. And no matter what he wrote to her, she would say, I think it would be, she used the word presumptuous. The only word in all those letters that she misspelled was presumptuous. She said presumptuous or something. It would be presumptuous to fuss with those we love. So she signaled early on that no matter what he did, she was going to be very centered and not be upset and put up with him.
And you can correct me if I remember reading this wrong, but wasn't it hinted to by some of her confidants and some of the documents you found that LBJ would have these panic attacks where he would come into the bedroom and he would want to stay under the covers, and she was the one to convince him to keep going?
Well, he would get in really depressed periods, and I was able to read, one of the reasons it took me so long to do the book was the Unpublished Diary was just finally opened. Some of you probably have read the big published diary, which is about 800 pages. But I can't say she wrote, because she didn't write it, she recorded. She had a little tape recorder, and each day she would talk into that. And if she couldn't find time that day to talk, she had a brown envelope with each day dated separately, and she would throw into it articles or guest lists or appointments, and then later record. So this came out to be an enormous, I forget how many thousands of words, that had to be transcribed by secretaries who didn't always understand her accent. And so when I started working on the book in 2009, I was told that they were for sure going to have that ready for me, ready for everybody, but I could use it, by her 100th birthday, which would have been 2012. So 2012 came, no, they didn't have any more, and so I finally got the last installment just in June of this year, the very last year. And in that diary, in the Unpublished Diary, she talks quite a lot about, oh, Lyndon's in a real, this was in the White House years, because that's when she recorded the diary. Lyndon's in a really foul mood today, I don't know what caused it. And then a day or so later, she'd say, he's in a great mood today, I don't know what sprung him. So she realized the enormous mood swings. She never used the word manic depressive or bipolar, but she was certainly aware of the mood swings that he went through. And the occasion that you mentioned, she singled it out as the time that she really did influence his presidency. She was not averse to taking credit. She always did it in a very ladylike way, but she wasn't one of those people like Eleanor Roosevelt who would say, oh no, I never try to influence Franklin on anything he does, which we know, of course, that was not true. She was not averse to saying that she gave Lyndon good judgment and that sometimes he took it. She never said he took it all the time. And he certainly, nobody commanded Lyndon Johnson all the time. But anyway, the instance that she singled out, and that I think you're referring to, was the 1964 Democratic Convention, which was held in Atlantic City. The Republicans had already nominated Barry Goldwater in July, And Lyndon Johnson, of course, everybody thought that he wanted to run for a term of his own. Remember, the assassination of President Kennedy occurred in November of '63. Lyndon Johnson became president, and then he finished that. It's a little over a year, really, of President Kennedy's term, and then he wanted to run for his own term in November of 1964. Now, it's not at all clear that he would have gotten that nomination, at least the Johnsons felt, that Bobby Kennedy really wanted that nomination, and somehow at the last minute he might somehow maneuver to get it. And Lyndon Johnson had other problems in August of 1964. There was a question of the civil rights movement, a question of seating delegations. He was beginning to get a lot of criticism on Vietnam. He was feeling really depressed. So on that August day, when the Democrats were ready to start this convention in Atlantic City, Lyndon Johnson was in Washington and refusing to go up to Atlantic City. And his chief aide, who was up there, a man by the name of Walter Jenkins, didn't know what to do. He called back, he spoke to the press secretary, and the press secretary said, I don't know, he says he won't go. He used really foul language, which I think I use in the book. I repeat some of the language in the book. You know, let him nominate somebody else. I've had enough of them, you know, let him. I remember he said, let them choose a better educated man, a Harvard man. He was always kind of insecure about his education. So what to do? I mean, you've got a real mess there, right? So the aides did what they often did when they couldn't budge Lyndon Johnson. They went to Lady Bird, and she wrote a letter, and she said, Dear Lyndon, I have the full text in there, but anyway, just remember you're as good as any of the presidents before you. If you bow out now, you would be pleasing your enemies and frustrating your friends. I love you always, do what you want to do, but I love you always and will support you always. She put the letter by the bedstand, and then she went out and walked on the lawn of the White House. And she said in the Unpublished Diary that she could look up there and see the blinds drawn, and she knew that he was in there wrestling with his own demons. But of course we know now that he got up and went to that convention and was nominated and won in the biggest landslide recorded up to that time. So she singled that out as a time when she had influence. She also, in the Unpublished Diary, talks about how he would be very concerned about an issue and would waken her at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they would talk about how we're going to handle this or how we're going to handle that. So I think she was not averse to taking credit for having some influence.
Do you find a change in who she is and how she reacts to the world from before Jack Kennedy's assassination to after? Does she respond to that like many of us maybe with if our significant other is President of the United States, and be a little bit more concerned and a little more involved in trying to make sure that they stay safe?
She said she never worried about security because she didn't think it was in her destiny. That's probably just a defense mechanism. But I think what I thought you were leading up to was how did she feel taking the job of First Lady and his taking the job of President, particularly at that very terrible time. I mean, you think back to November 1963, it was a terrible way to become president, right? And she said that she felt she was on stage for a part she never rehearsed. But in fact, I mean, I've written a lot about First Ladies, and no one ever came better prepared for the job than she. Because remember, she had lived in Washington part of every year for more than 30 years. She knew reporters by first name. She knew the wives of congressmen because she'd been an active member of the Congressional Wives when Lyndon was in the House. And then she was a very active member of the Senate Wives when he was in the Senate. So she knew everybody. And one of the first things that the Johnsons did was, well, of course, there was a month of mourning, so no social events took place at the White House during that month. But when that ended, they started really currying favor with journalists and congressmen, senators. You know, it's typical for a president to entertain Congress in a big reception or two maybe, have 200 or 300 people there in one evening. But the Johnsons were very clever. They broke it down into a dozen or 15, and they had 2 or 3 a week. And they would invite the congressman or the senator and the wife, and in this small group, so they could greet them by first name and, talk about their children and really befriend them, right? And then Lady Bird did something that also made a big impression. She would take the wives upstairs to walk through the residential quarters, she knew that many of those wives had lived in Washington for years and never been invited upstairs. Jackie Kennedy was famous for not wanting anybody to stay over. She was, let's be honest, she wanted to protect the privacy of her young children who would be, you didn't want a lot of strangers running around the residential quarters. But she went to unusual lengths. I wrote in one book that when the Kennedys knew that somebody was going to come visiting that would expect to be invited to stay overnight, they covered the furniture as though the room was being painted and said it wouldn't be possible for anybody to stay overnight. So that gives you some indication of the
There's so many people who are going to try that trick with Thanksgiving coming up. You've got that crazy uncle that's coming to town. Go get yourself some tarps at Home Depot, right?
Yeah, it will work. Yeah. I always think it's interesting that both Jackie Kennedy and Lady Bird Johnson were journalists in the sense that Jackie Kennedy worked as a reporter and Lady Bird Johnson had a degree in journalism. I mean, she had 2 degrees, one in liberal arts, history and philosophy, and the other in journalism. She never worked as a journalist, but she said they always wanted a newspaper and then couldn't afford that, so that's why they got into the radio business. But they handled the press. Jackie and Lady Bird handled the press in completely different ways. Jackie didn't want them around. She called them harpies, who were always after, she was afraid they would photograph her with a cigarette or they would photograph her with a glass of wine. She didn't want them around her children. When I did the first book on First Ladies many years ago, I interviewed Pierre Salinger, who at that time was in Paris, and he said that his job as press secretary to John F. Kennedy was one of his jobs was to keep the press away from Jackie, because she didn't want any coverage. Lady Bird hires the most aggressive, ambitious press secretary I think we've probably ever had, Liz Carpenter, who really worked hard to make her appear in a favorable light, to publicize her activities, to show that she was a good partner.
My mom and dad tell the story that in 1967 or 68, the year of the disaster with the astronauts, Mom and Dad were in New York and stationed in the military, and the Johnsons came to visit one of the astronauts' wives, and when they made a visit, they visited with many of the military members, and my mom got to shake Lady Bird's hand, and she was stricken by how pretty Lady Bird was. You see these pictures, and people talk about she probably was not the most attractive first lady we've ever had, but here she was following Jackie Kennedy. And you've seen the pictures, she was really an attractive woman in her own way, was she not?
Well, I never saw Lady Bird Johnson, to my great regret. I once requested an interview in the 1980s, and she couldn't do it because I think she was ill at the time. So I never met her, but everybody said that she had the most gracious manner and was much more attractive than her pictures, that she didn't take a good picture.
Okay, since we're still talking about the Kennedys and the Johnsons, did they get along well?
The Kennedys and the Johnsons. That would be a good book. Lady Bird always said that she considered the Kennedys another generation. She thought Jackie was more her daughter's generation. And in 1960, when of course the question was who would be the nominee for the Democratic Party, it wasn't so much that the Johnsons felt Kennedy didn't have a future, but they thought it was too early and he was not experienced enough, his time had not come. So they start out, I think, respectful of each other. I've always heard that President Kennedy was particularly careful to be nothing but civil, to treat well Lyndon Johnson in public. Jackie is quoted in many places as saying some very nasty things about Lady Bird. that she was servile, she did everything Lyndon wanted. I think one of the lines was attributed to Jackie Kennedy. She said, Lady Bird would crawl down Pennsylvania Avenue on broken glass for Lyndon. And another case, she said something about she follows him around like a hunting dog follows. Just kind of really nasty things. On the other hand, right after the Democratic Convention ended in 1960, and it was clear that it was going to be a Kennedy-Johnson ticket, the Johnsons went up to Cape Cod, to the Kennedy compound. They stayed only 24 hours, and it must have been some 24 hours because the Kennedys didn't have a guest suite that they could give the Johnsons, so they cleared all their things out of their bedroom, and the Johnsons used that, and there were meetings held, and Jackie said that she was very impressed that Lady Bird Johnson could be sitting in the corner of her room talking to Jackie and her sister, who was visiting at that time. And the men could be over in another corner, and Lady Bird had her she always carried a little notebook. And she would be, every time she heard a name or a number or an important fact from the men's side of the room, she would jot it down, all the while continuing the conversation with Jackie and her sister. And Jackie said, I was very impressed by that.
Okay, since we're talking about the Johnsons and the Kennedys and something else that they had in common, it's something I know we don't want to dwell on all night, but LBJ was known for carousing a little bit. And I think that one of the things about your book that really struck me was how Lady Bird would have these conversations with some of the women that she knew her husband was courting. How she would even compliment them.
Well, that's the coverage often given. That remember, the Johnsons came into the White House. They were the very first presidential couple to live there when it was actually reported what the sexual activities of the president might be. You don't find that any time before. I mean, we've certainly had some womanizers in the White House, and you do not find that reported in the press during the time they're in office. You find it later. I mean, just think about FDR and the Lucy Mercer story. That did not come out as long as Eleanor Roosevelt was alive. It came out later. And even the Kennedy, I mean, certainly I remember, I'm sure some of you remember, I was in school at the time, in college at the time, that John Kennedy was president, and I remember one young woman, student, lived in Washington, and she used to come back every weekend with some story. I mean, the stories circulate a lot privately, but you didn't find them in the press, and Jackie Kennedy never was faced with a question about it. In come the Johnsons in 1963, and Lyndon, and this is very well documented, calls in the reporters and he says something like to the effect, now you're going to see a woman coming in and out of my bedroom sometimes, and you guys just aren't going to write about that, just the way you didn't write about it with President Kennedy. So he admits really early on that they're going to have something to write about. And he really goads them into writing, I think, about it. Time magazine in 1964, and that would be his first spring vacation at the ranch as president, he's riding around in this convertible, surrounded by beautiful young reporters, and the Time magazine reports that they're cooing in his ear, Mr. President, you're fun. So he really circulated those stories. He seemed to enjoy being known as a womanizer. Now, your other question about how she treated them, that gets complicated. But first of all, I have to say that her father was a womanizer, and she knew it. She said, my father had women who were not part of the domestic scene, because after her mother died, you translate that, right? After her mother died, he married, 2 years later, he married a very young woman, and then divorced her about 15 years later after he charged that she was seeing other men. And then he married a third time a woman who was younger than Lady Bird. So he had 3 wives, but he was certainly had a reputation around Harrison County of being a womanizer. Second, I would say that Lyndon very early signaled in those courtship letters that he was like her father in that regard. He wrote a letter from Washington. Again, remember back in 1934, she's in Texas and he's in Washington. He wrote her a letter saying that he'd been out with Helen, a little radio writer, and they had danced until 2 o'clock. And they had another letter, they were out dining and so forth. So I kept looking in her letters back to him, what's she going to say? Because these were the very same letters that he was asking Lady Bird to marry him. I think in that situation, I would have said, you know, what's going on with Helen or something, right? She never mentions Helen in those letters. But later in an interview, she said, I knew that the relationship with Helen was not platonic, but she was the daughter of an important judge in New York. She was a very sophisticated person, and I thought she would sharpen Lyndon up a little bit. So that was him. She always talked about wanting to learn from the other women. One of the stories that sort of shocked me in the Unpublished Diary was very soon after the assassination. I mean, it was in the first 3 months of their presidency. She talks about going to a party at the home in Washington of a reporter with whom Lyndon's name was often attached. To this woman who is still alive, so I won't mention her name. I don't really go into great detail about it in the book. Lady Bird said, this woman is wearing a shimmering gown. She looks like a mermaid. And all the men seem to like her. I guess I'll have to watch more carefully and learn from her. So she's always talking about learning from the people that Lyndon found attractive. I also would add that she, whether there was anything going on, and many people said that a lot of what was reported as going on was really more for show than for any actual, for what really happened. But Lyndon loved the attention of beautiful women. And Lady Bird said in one of the interviews, Lyndon always wanted the most beautiful young woman beside him. Tonight it is this one. And she really, you can see it in the Vietnam years when the criticism of the White House, of the Johnson presidency, got really bad. You know, she said that the first 2 years were wine and roses, but the last few years were pure hell. And she made a real point of inviting the people. You see the same people for Sunday lunch, week after week. The people that made him feel good, the people who wouldn't talk about Vietnam or problems that he was having. So you add that all up, everybody said that she would put up with anything if she thought Lyndon needed it. In other words, one person went to her to get a man fired, and she was known not to like this man, and so the staff person who went to get her help firing the man was sure that she would, you know, say something to Lyndon about getting rid of him. And she thought it over, and she said, no, Lyndon needs him, so he stays. So she had an amazing ability to put up with what she didn't like or want if she thought her husband's ambitions would be realized if she kept quiet.
You talked about the criticism of the war in Vietnam and how it started to really weigh on LBJ and the presidency. And I find it interesting, there's a picture in the book of long after LBJ is gone, Lady Bird on a boat with a dear friend, somebody who was not necessarily someone who was full of praise for the Vietnam War, Walter Cronkite.
Right. Those of you who remember that period know that Lyndon Johnson and Walter Cronkite came to very sharp words over Vietnam policy. Cronkite went there and said it was a war that can never be won, and of course Lyndon Johnson didn't want to hear that. So there was a split over that, and there was perhaps an even bigger split after Lyndon Johnson left the White House. He had arranged to do some interviews with Cronkite. I think there were 8 of them. And then they were going on different topics like civil rights in Vietnam and so forth. And then these were going to be edited into a program that would highlight the Johnson presidency. And the money from that, I think that President Johnson was to be paid $300,000 for doing these interviews, and that was all to go to the Lyndon Johnson Library. But Lyndon Johnson was furious at the way they were edited. He thought they showed the presidency in a bad light. They made him look bad. And he was furious with Walter Cronkite. But after he died, Lady Bird, who had gone to school with Walter Cronkite, they were both in journalism school at the University of Texas 1 year. They didn't know each other, but they had been there the same year. She is boating with him on Martha's Vineyard. Because remember, Martha's Vineyard was the sort of place that Lyndon Johnson, he said, that's where those East Coast liberals live. Those people are out to get me, you know, those Harvards that don't like me. And Lady Bird went to Martha's Vineyard for several summers in the 1980s and rented a house for a month and got very friendly with people like Cronkite, Jackie Kennedy, who also rented a house there, other people. So that's a way that she expresses her own determination after he's gone. You know, she had 34 years after he died. A big chunk. She died at just short of her 95th birthday. So 34 years, that's a big chunk of that time. And it's very interesting how she used it, I think. She told Barbara Walters that during her marriage, which was almost 40 years, she put things on the shelf. And when Lyndon died, she took them down. And one of them was travel, foreign travel. She took some really exotic trips all over the world. She'd get a group of people, friends, or her daughters or granddaughters, and she took some wonderful trips.
I read the book, and it was wonderful, and I know you're quite prolific in writing about presidents' wives. Do you perhaps see a great similarity between Nancy Davis Reagan and Bird as far as maybe it's generational, but they were perhaps the type of women that made themselves absolutely indispensable to their husbands' lives and success?
That's a good comparison to make. They were slightly different in age. Lady Bird was born in 1912 and Nancy Reagan in 1921, although she always said 1923. That's incorrect. You can check that. So they're pretty similar in age. And they were both very influential in their husbands' presidencies and careers, I would say that. The big difference is Nancy Reagan would never admit it. I remember once on a book that I did, it's an illustrated history of America's first ladies, and it talks about, because it's mostly pictures, there's a chapter on the influence of the first ladies on their husbands' presidencies. And I started off by quoting newspapers who say that during the Reagan administration, she became a kind of associate president. You know, she had a very big role. Remember, he was shot, of course, and he was ill at different times, and she had a lot of influence on who was making the decisions and so forth. So I start my chapter off with a paragraph about her, and my editor had the idea that it would be nice to get a little blurb from Nancy Reagan. I said, that's not a good idea. But they sent the manuscript off, and it came back beside that paragraph in her handwriting, not true.
Did you save the manuscript?
No, I didn't. She had a very distinctive handwriting. So if you think about her book, My Turn, to tell her story that she wrote after leaving the White House, she plays down on every turn her influence. For example, remember there was the firing of the chief of staff. His name was Reagan, right?
Donald Reagan.
Donald Reagan, not to be confused with Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And people thought that she had a big hand in getting him out of there. She didn't like him. But she said, if I had been as influential as people say, he would have been out sooner. So in other words, she, at every turn, plays down her influence, as did Eleanor Roosevelt. So it's interesting that Lady Bird didn't mind saying, I have influence. Maybe she said it with such a southern accent and dripping so much honey that it was okay. It would have come out a little different from Nancy Reagan's mouth, perhaps.
We have another question.
Tell us about Lady Bird as a mother to those two daughters.
Lady Bird as a mother. Lady Bird, actually the opening page in the book talks about her being at the wedding of her older daughter, Linda, the first White House wedding of a president's daughter in 50 years. sitting there thinking and knowing that people said she was not a good mother. Her daughters complained a lot growing up that she was not a good mother. She was gone all the time. And she said, Lyndon comes first, the girls come second, and I come third. The girls said, Lyndon comes first, her broadcasting business comes second, and we come third. And there are conversations, people told me about being present at conversations when the girls would object because she would go to Texas campaigning. We're talking about the early years when they're growing up, the 40s and 50s, right? And she would be gone for weeks and promise to be back on a Sunday night and then call and say, I can't do it, I have to stay here. And there were some very, very sad times for the daughters. But in her unpublished diary, she says, I know people said that, but it's not enough for me to get a guilt complex about it. So she didn't indicate she would have done it differently. And I want to say in her defense that I interviewed other people growing up in Washington in the 40s and 50s, and they said that was very typical of politicians, that the kids didn't count. One woman told me, she was the daughter of a famous journalist, she said, we kids were just supposed to watch our toe marks for the photographs and keep our mouths shut. And I thought the other day when Paul Ryan made the comment about taking the speakership but not decreasing the time with his family, I thought how un-1940s that is. Yeah. You know, it was a very different world that they lived in. Yeah. Did that answer your question about them? I should say that after Lyndon died, she gave enormous attention to her daughters and granddaughters. And I think now that they're a little embarrassed about what went before and what they said before. In fact, they wouldn't sit down for an interview with me. They would answer questions like, did Jackie Kennedy come to your birthday party or something like that? Or did your mother know about the taping of the telephone conversations? But they didn't want an open-ended interview. And I think it must be very painful for them now, wanting, you know, both parents are gone, wanting to put the best light possibly that they can on their mother, to be reminded of things they said when they were young. So I don't know that I would sit down for an interview about my mother.
We have a question over here.
Yes, if I may have a two-part question. Thank you, Dr. Caroli, for coming here. My first question, I have not read your book yet, so this is all kind of new to me, but you said that Lady Bird's father was, you know, very commanding, domineering even, and it seems to me that she was conditioned to live and, you know, eventually marry a man who was just like her father, and you said that she was very supportive of Lyndon. Do you think this was a more because she really loved him, or a survival, that she knew no different, and she did it just to keep...
Many people said that you couldn't understand what she saw in Lyndon unless you knew her great adoration for her father. Mm-hmm. I mean, her diary is just full of what she loves in Lyndon, his commanding presence, the things that she loved in her father, the take charge attitude, the ambition. I have in the book the photos that they sent each other in October after they had met in September, and he's sitting there looking like this, and she wrote back and she said, you know how I hate arrogance in a person, and you look very arrogant in this picture, but I decided in you it's just a nice, commanding personality, and I like it. So she could, she never expressed regret at the marriage. She always thought she was number one with him, and that she had had an important role in his getting as much done as he did. She would often say, you know, when the daughters would complain about the time that they weren't getting, she would say Lyndon's work is the most important thing. What he can do for the country is more important than anything in the family. So she thought she had a role in that. She certainly wanted to get out of that part of Texas. Ambition was very much a part of that marriage, I think.
Well, my second question is, you mentioned that Lady Bird often, you know, was not shy about taking credit for her influence on her husband. And then you have Eleanor, who as we know, was, very activist first lady, but was very humble about it because she also had very severe self-esteem issues from her own upbringing. And you mentioned, I believe, Nancy Reagan and the generational difference. Now, Lady Bird and Eleanor Roosevelt were 28 years apart, so definitely.
Let's see, Eleanor was born in 84, I
84,
think.
yeah, so 84 and 12, so, yeah.
15 and 12, 25. It's a generation,
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah.
So, do you think that Lady Bird was influenced consciously or not by the example of Eleanor and Franklin?
Well,
especially with things like knowing that Eleanor had Lucy Mercer Rutherford, among others.
Yeah. Remember that Lady Bird Johnson gets to Washington at the time when Eleanor's in the White House, so she certainly knew what was going on. And as far as the Lucy Mercer thing, which came out, as we said, after Eleanor's death, so it would be about the time Lady Bird is in the White House, not quite, but about. Lady Bird didn't see what all the fuss was about, why Eleanor would have been upset by Lucy Mercer. She said, it's just a little speck on the wedding cake. So she didn't understand, because remember, this gets into another book, I didn't mention it here, but Eleanor Roosevelt, when she learned of Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer right at the end of World War I in 1918, when she was unpacking a suitcase because he'd gone to France, and the letters made clear that Lucy, who was Eleanor's secretary, social secretary, and Franklin were involved in a very intimate relationship. And she offered him a divorce, and they didn't get divorced, they stayed together and so forth. And then in the White House, in the early 40s, Lucy resumes visits with Franklin. And these were arranged partly by the Roosevelt daughter. And it really, Eleanor makes very clear that she felt the daughter had betrayed her. Nobody is saying that the visits were sexual necessarily, but the daughter would arrange for Franklin to spend time alone with Lucy Mercer. And so that's what Lady Bird was objecting to, that Eleanor should not have been upset. But the other part about Eleanor, remember, would always say, I don't influence my husband on anything. And Lady Bird never said that.
Well, as we wrap up here on one last set of rapid-fire questions, because I know that a lot of you want to get back there and get a chance to meet Betty, I'm going to name the First Lady, and one word, you describe them, all right?
Oh.
Okay. You knew this was coming, didn't you? Nancy Reagan.
Tough.
Betty Ford.
Sweet.
Rosalind Carter.
Strong.
Barbara Bush.
Barbara Bush is hard to describe because, they say, can I have more than one word on her?
Change the rules. Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Because people say there is no first lady whose public image was so at contrast with her private image. There is no woman with such a strong, in other words, she had the reputation of being the grandmotherly type, right? Okay. And she would make fun of herself and the size clothes she wore and so forth. But she was one tough lady behind the...
tough cookie.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last one, Lady Bird Johnson.
Lady Bird Johnson is the model for all first ladies. I mean, she did what the others are trying to match, right? No, just think about it. She had her own project, the beautification. She had the biggest professional staff up to that time. She wrote the book after she left the White House, which they all do. She practically built the LBJ library. I mean, from the very beginning, she was in on choosing the architect, choosing the site. So I think she's the model for all first ladies. And if we have a first man, he'll do the same things. I mean, I really think that.
Good. Very good.
Don't you think?
Betty, thank you for gracing us with your time tonight. Thank you. And thanks for coming out.